Jon came across my radar because of a series of blog posts you wrote. So you were basically creating your own SaaS platform using other SaaS platforms, I guess, and open source technologies, which we talked about this last time when you and I caught up, but I've been doing something similar as well, also with Auth0 and Stripe, and actually without a database. So I was really curious to have a chat with you and find out what your journey was, what your goals were. So do you want to, well, first of all, start by introducing yourself and give us a bit of context about you, but also let us know what got you interested in creating this SaaS product in the first place, whether it scratched an itch or what the purpose was.
Sure. So yeah, I'm Jon Meyers. I've been working as a software developer for about 7 years, and have sort of been teaching in different capacities throughout that time. And so started off teaching at university, and then started teaching at a boot camp after that. And yeah, I've always sort of had teaching as part of my career in some way. And so yeah, the kind of idea behind this SaaS project was firstly that I wanted to I guess learn a little bit more about Stripe. So I'd used Stripe in to a lesser extent in another project where I had implemented just standalone payments. And so this was an opportunity to kind of really investigate subscription-based billing. So building a software as a service project or a SaaS. And so yeah, this project was really good for that because it had kind of the idea behind the example that I used for the blog series was a courses platform. And so there are free courses that any user can view, premium courses that you can either buy and then own for life, or subscribe to access all of the courses across the platform. And so, yeah, I thought this was an interesting one to tackle because it kind of uses Stripe in two different ways. It uses it as a just individual payments, as well as that kind of subscription-based based billing, which was cool. So the stack that I used was Next.js, Auth0, Prisma, and Stripe. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the idea was to I had some experience with all those different technologies, but hadn't gone super deeply, and so was looking to kind of focus on a project where I could learn in public. And as you mentioned, I released a blog series, so I was kind of releasing a blog each week that was focusing on a different area of the stack, and sort of what problems I faced, how I solved them, and kind of tried to document a little bit about the decision-making process there. And then also, I guess, steps to actually follow along and re-implement it. And then that was turned into a more high-level Egghead, a case study that went out on the Egghead blog. Yeah. And so that looks more like architecturally at the whole system. And yeah, in terms of it scratching an itch, I feel like both as a developer and a teacher, it was super interesting. I think that it would have been much more difficult to do if I just needed to rely on just technical docs and things like that. But I think because the web development community is so awesome, there were so many guides and bits and pieces that I could glue together from what existed out in the world. It
can sometimes be a little bit of a double-edged sword, I think, the amount of documentation and often conflicting, not necessarily inaccurate, but different people's perspectives. It can be hard to sift through and work out exactly what works and what doesn't. So it sounds like, obviously, a lot of this, you've mentioned teaching, I think, within one sentence about 7 times. So teaching is obviously really important to you. Was a SaaS project the first thing that came to mind when you thought about a way of doing this? Is it a product you actually want to run commercially, or was it just a tool for teaching? What made you choose this as the actual project to run?
Yeah, so I guess like the default project that you could jump into building for a teaching example is a to-do app, and I think people are
True.
pretty
we have
pretty
enough of
used to
those.
seeing that. Yeah, that's right.
Totally.
And they are really good to show like a system where you don't need to learn the context of what you're teaching. But I thought it was a little bit unrealistic to be able to charge subscription-based access to a to-do list.
Yeah, I don't know. Atlassian have managed to do that. So
well, that's true.
Maybe I'll be there one day.
Yeah, or maybe the competition's a little too fierce.
Maybe there are a lot of options out there. That's true. And also, I suppose it depends on the level of functionality you get from that to-do list.
Yeah, for sure. But I felt like a SaaS project really like contains all the bits that are transferable to another project. And so like obviously I wanted to focus on Stripe, but I also wanted to kind of cover some concepts in Next.js and talk about how to build a nice UI that has some static stuff going on. So building some static pages that has some dynamic stuff that's happening on the client side. It's got some dynamic stuff that needs to happen at the server rendering point. It's got a database, it's got authentication. And so all of those things I think are core to most projects that you would work on. So payments is just kind of like a bonus on top of that. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot to take away, even if you're not building an e-commerce or SaaS project.
And it's an interesting perspective as well, because it's not new that we use a lot more cloud technologies now than we did, say, 15 years ago. Definitely 15 years ago, but even like 5 years ago or so. But a lot more were doing that. So a to-do project would probably not necessarily use many third-party systems, whereas your SaaS uses many other SaaSes, which is kind of, it's the norm nowadays, right? It's all about building a product as quickly as possible and focusing just on what your product, how your product differentiates from the market or the value it provides to its customers, without having to worry about the payments and the auth and the deployments and all of those kind of things. So sure. It's a really good way of linking all of those together. What was it that, like, how did you come to a decision of which different platforms or even projects, like in the case of Next.js, the platforms and the stacks to use? What was the process behind that?
Yeah, so this started out as actually an Egghead dev portfolio club, and so Egghead have organized groups of people to get together each week and kind of solve similar problems together. So it's kind of like a book club, but with code. So each week you have a chapter that you're meant to read, or potentially some blog articles to read, and a potential part of the stack that you need to solve. And then we come back together at the end of that week and kind of talk through what we learned and what the interesting bits were. And so yeah, that was kind of a good opportunity to learn in public, and because there was that focus on different parts of the stack. It was an easy way to kind of communicate that. It might not have been so segregated and simple if it was like if it was a business application where I just kind of needed to implement everything at once, but having that different focus each week was really good. So the first decision I think I made was Next.js. And so, yeah, I think at this point, I was thinking about it the other day, and I don't know when I would not use Next.js for something at the moment, if I was building a UI or building a front end or web app, just because it kind of like, it starts off so simple. It's really easy to get a super fast React app up and running. But then if you need to do static site generation or pre-generation, if you need to fetch some data that is okay to be public to everybody, then you can use the static site generation side of things. If you need some protected data, then it gives you serverless functions, or it gives you the ability to tie into that server side rendering.
So it's got that hybrid model as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so I really like that it kind of starts off simple. Like you can get up and running with just a React app and just, for the most part, just write a regular kind of front end React app. You'll run into a couple of problems, but it starts off so simple, and then it's kind of that incremental release of complexity as you want to go deeper and deeper. They kind of have these problems really well solved, which is interesting. And then
I heard somebody the other day make a comparison as well between Next.js and Gatsby, and I love React. If I've got to do any kind of front end application, it's usually React that I'll default to, but I'll generally wrap it around Gatsby just so that I have that static site rendering capability if I need it in the future, and various other things that Gatsby, even just from a development perspective, gives me out of the box. But this comparison, and I have to admit, I've not used Next.js much at all, but the comparison said that Next.js compared to Gatsby for all the things that are like where the Venn diagram where it overlaps, where they do the same thing, is still light years ahead in terms of speed of ramping up, getting code going, development process. Have you played with Gatsby much, and would you say the same?
Yeah. I think like Gatsby gave me my introduction into that world of static site generation and kind of how important that was, and got me really excited about it. And then I think the things that I really liked about Next.js when I picked it up were that I think in Gatsby, you've kind of got very separate ideas for what's happening server side and what's happening client side. So you've got your or I say client side, but the component side of things, and then you've got this Gatsby node file, which is where all of your node process stuff happens. So that all runs when you build your application. The thing that I liked about Next, which might be really confusing coming to it with fresh eyes if you've never experienced any of that idea of building a static site, is that it is kind of mixed in together. Like you declare these bits of logic within your components or within your component file that are the server-side logic that runs at build time. And it's not very clear unless you understand that kind of mental model that's what's going on. But from a authoring an app perspective, I think it's really nice not having to switch context and think like this is happening at a different time. All you need to worry about is that this component needs this data, and this data isn't going to change, so we can feed it in statically. I like that kind of co-location of that stuff, even though they are kind of separate concerns. And then I guess the thing that Next gives you that Gatsby doesn't give you or didn't give you at the time when I was using it is the ability to tie into that server side rendering point. And so you can also make a request for additional data. You can check authentication. You can do some pretty complex server side logic, but at runtime when the user is requesting a page, which is super cool.
Yeah, that
and
is
so I guess. And so using Next.js, obviously I needed a place to host it. And so Vercel seemed like a very logical choice for that.
Yeah.
Because Vercel obviously build Next.js as well as a cloud hosting platform.
That's right.
And so
it'll tie into their API functions and everything quite easily as well, I guess.
Exactly.
All of that's just magic out of the box.
No configuration, no need to worry about things. Netlify have also done some awesome stuff in allowing you to deploy a Next.js application with no configuration now.
Cool.
But when new features come out in Next.js, they're immediately available in Vercel, because obviously they build both.
Of course,
and so I feel
it makes sense.
It's a little bit more seamless, which is nice. At the data level, the reason that I chose Prisma was just that it's a very nice way to interact with your data. And so if anyone's not familiar, Prisma is an ORM or a query builder. It just basically allows you to communicate with your data in the database like it was code. And so you can kind of treat it like a big JSON blob, rather than needing to think about writing an SQL query or something like that. So it just makes that interaction a little bit more JavaScript-like in a JavaScript world, I guess. So the reason that Prisma kind of stood out over other options there was they have recently released migrations. And so migrations is a really nice way to structurally change your data as your data requirements change. And so since this was going to be an educational project where I was going to be kind of focusing on a different part of the stack each week, I hadn't really thought out from the start what my data layer was going to look like. And so it was really important for that to be able to change and be able to add columns and add tables without losing the data that exists in there, which I think is a very realistic requirement for most production applications.
Definitely.
So coming from a Rails background.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, coming from a Rails background, I think that data is such a core part of your application, and Rails has really solved that, like interacting with the database being easy and sort of working in with your application nicely. And so I feel like Prisma has really nailed that in the Node world in a way that I don't think or in my experience, I haven't felt like other ORMs have managed to do as nicely in Node.
I'll definitely have to try that one out. I still remember I come from a PHP background, and when Cake PHP came out, which was kind of a PHP re-implementation of Ruby on Rails, the just that similar ORM kind of access to easy CRUD, like the manipulation and entering and updating of data in the database, was it was just amazing to have that that level of easy access to the data without having to go into the underlying depths of how those requests actually got created. I've been doing a lot with GraphQL recently, and that's similarly complex in the fact that you still have to understand to a certain extent the structure. Obviously, you've got like the sandboxes and so on where you can kind of build those queries. Was there a reason why you stuck with a more traditional ORM based on top of SQL rather than going with GraphQL?
Yeah, so I think with this project, introducing so many different concepts already, I was really trying to minimize anything else that would sneak in.
That's a series of its own, isn't it, GraphQL?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so GraphQL, I think just would have added to the overall complexity of, or maybe just the new ideas that might be introduced to people. Right. Personally, I love GraphQL, and if I was building something like this for production, I would definitely be using GraphQL, because it's similarly to Prisma. It just makes like querying data across multiple tables, like those kind of complex relationships between data. It just makes it so much more simple and so much more like code and more like the way that you're going to need to iterate over it to present it in the UI or something like that.
Yeah. And from a database management perspective as well, it just alleviates so much of that. Especially when you're working on your own project, there's a lot less tension or in a production environment where you work in a company, you'd have a database administrator and the developers, and they've got to work together to make sure that the schema matches the data they want, and then you've got the API developers in the middle, and GraphQL just removes all of that overhead and just says, you know what, there's data, you can request it in whatever format you like. I just love that aspect. Of course, you can still get into performance issues around that, but dig yourself a very deep hole.
I'm currently working at Upbank, but prior to, we also use GraphQL, but I was going to say it in my previous role, I was at REA Group, which is, they make realestate.com.au for anyone outside of Australia. That's, just like the leading real estate listing company here in Australia. And having such a massive organization with so many different teams, GraphQL really like solved that problem of needing to needing buy-in from API developers and needing buy-in from database people. And it was really seamless working across multiple teams, across multiple databases, with this nice big GraphQL schema that we could just kind of request what we needed from. Definitely helps.
Totally.
So back on Prisma, the thing that Prisma is not is an actual database host. And so it handles all of the talking to the database. It handles those structural changes to the database, adding columns, adding tables and things like that. But it doesn't handle hosting an actual database instance. And so I used Supabase to host a Postgres instance off in the cloud, which was, also an awesome experience. Supabase can do so much more than what I was using it for. I was just using it to host a database, but it can also do that ORM layer, like what I'm using Prisma for. It can query the database. It has real-time stuff where you can subscribe to changes in the database, and it can do auth and all kinds of things. But the main reason that I chose Auth0 to handle that one part of the problem is just that the Next.js integration was so awesome. So there was like, there's a new, I don't think it's new. It's new on my radar, but a Next.js library built by Auth0.
Yeah.
That just
I think it's
ties
relatively new. It was released within the last year or so, because before that we had the SPA single page app generic SDK, and we've gone out and done a Next.js and a React, and I think there's an Angular one as well now. So trying to make that easier.
Nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, just it so perfectly tied into all of those different bits that I was talking about before with Next.js, like having the server-side logic, having the client-side logic. It was just, it just kind of simply answered the question for me of like, should I trust the user right now? Like, should this user have access to this thing? And that's super, super handy because I haven't dedicated my career to studying authentication and authorization and security threats and all those kinds of things that come along with authentication and authorization. And so it was really nice being able to just kind of abstract that away and say, all right, Auth0 has people that do that. Auth0 will stay on top of that stuff, and I can just focus on building the application that actually kind of provides value to my users. Which is was super cool. And then obviously Stripe as the last part of that stack. Like dealing with payments. I think Stripe is probably a little bit of a default. The APIs are awesome. The documentation is awesome. Like, it's such a mature product that it's just they've really nailed how to do individual payments, subscriptions, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And similarly in the realm of like, I haven't spent my career studying how payments can be taken safely and how to store people's credit cards and all the vulnerabilities that exist in
definitely don't want to get into that side of things now.
No, like detecting fraud and all of those things. I'm happy for someone else to worry about that.
Quick shout out to James, who's just joined us in the chat. He's the colleague over in the US. James, you're actually featured not by name, but I'm going to out you now at the beginning of this session, because we were talking about time zones and how the word central appears in 22 different time zones. So I think you know what I'm talking about. But yes, I'm glad you're around and jumping in for a quick pop in. It's I didn't check on what your time zone is, but I'm guessing it's something like 8 p.m. for you. So I hope you're having a great day. And James also wants to play with Stripe. And it's definitely something, I've got some thoughts about Stripe as well, which we can kind of get into in the James is finding that funny. I'm assuming the relating of the time zones, not the fact that I want to use Stripe. There's a project that I was working on as well, but we'll come to that later.
Cool.
So just that pretty much that covers most of the stack. So you meant, because in the title we had Stripe, but you've also mentioned the Vercel and the reasons behind that.
So Vercel and Supabase were the other kind of like, I guess, supporting technologies. So hosting of database and hosting of the actual application.
Cool.
But other than that, all the ones in the title: Auth0, Stripe, Prisma, Next.js. Great stack.
So it's a great stack. And you've mentioned how easy it was to use Stripe and Auth0 to offload all the things you didn't want to do. But I can't imagine that it was plain sailing all the way through. Like, you didn't start coding and get to the end and go, "Woohoo, it works." So what kind of issues did you find while using? Because often when you're using third-party providers, there's documentation, and that can be varying depending on the product. It can be non-existent depending on some of the products. What kind of challenges did you face while piecing these things together? Is there anything that kind of stands out to you?
So using so many different technologies that distributed so widely was made sequencing pretty challenging. Yes. I think the big problem that I found with this, having these different pieces of tech all over the place, is like if you use something like Rails, everything is obviously in its own environment, and so everything is kind of already tweaked to work perfectly with everything else. And so trying to sequence when things should happen and how things should happen was a little bit challenging with these different services. Something that just made it amazingly more simple was webhooks. And so webhooks is just such a great technology for these kinds of distributed systems that have different things happening at different times and different responsibilities. So if you're not familiar, webhooks are a way that that you can say when like you can basically subscribe to events. So in Stripe's case, you can subscribe to when a payment happens. Tell me which course they purchased or whether it was a subscription, and then I'll handle the bit that I need to handle. So it's a way of kind of subscribing to events that you care about, which was super handy because this application got a little bit complex, having different kinds of users. So there are like free users who can just watch free courses. There are people who have bought individual courses. There are people who have subscribed to different courses. So there was a lot of data there that kind of that had different things that they could access within the app. So I kind of needed to know all of that data, and I started off by storing way too much data about that stuff. And so rather than just letting Stripe handle everything to do with subscriptions, I was saying, all right, well, my app needs to know if they're subscribed. It needs to know which subscription they've got, when they subscribed. And I was storing a whole bunch of information that was just kind of duplicated and unnecessary.
Sure.
And so over time, I kind of migrated more to the ideology of like just letting everything have its own responsibility. So I'll ask when I need to know something, but Auth0 can be completely in charge of signing in, my user database, anything to do with authentication. Yep. Stripe can be in charge of payment info, subscription info, anything to do with the money side of things. And Prisma can kind of be my local database where I glue all of those little bits together. So anything that my application needs to know directly can live in Prisma. And then once I had that kind of contract across all those different bits, it just meant that the first time a user logged in, I could kind of set up all of that infrastructure. So Auth0 could tell me that a new user has signed in. So again, using webhooks or using Auth0 rules, yep. I was able to say, when a user signs in for the first time, send me a message saying this is the user. And then I could create a customer off in Stripe's world. And then I could create a local Prisma user. And then everything was kind of wired up and had its own responsibilities. The only place that I kind of broke that contract, or I think somewhere that is good to consider whether you should break that contract, is if the application is kind of making multiple requests to multiple services at runtime. And so if there's if that kind of adds a lot of overhead waiting for different services to respond with the different bits of information that you need just to kind of resolve one request in the UI. I think that's a good point to start thinking about whether it would be more simple to duplicate some of that information. So an example of where I need to do that.
Jack's actually asked a question that was on my mind as well. When I think to the project that I did, I eliminated a database altogether by just using the app metadata in Auth0 and the metadata against a customer in Stripe, just to link those two together. One thing that I'm finding is that the types of actions that I want to take, especially those kind of offline background tasks that happen when the user isn't logged in, I'm not sure whether your platform has anything like that. There's a requirement to go off and get a lot of information from Stripe just to work out whether or not you should do something. And if a subscription level changes, if they go from Pro to Super Pro packages, those kind of things, you can get all that information via those webhooks. What is that minimum amount of information that you find you need to store in your own Postgres database in order for the application to run? How much can you offload, and what have you offloaded to, if anything, to Auth0 and into Stripe? Yeah,
sure. So yeah, I let Stripe be in charge of all of the payments that were happening, and just letting me know via webhooks when something needed to change in my database. So in my database, the things, I guess the thing that I was considering was what does my application need to know the most frequently, just to be able to display the information that the user's requesting. And one of the things that it needed to keep checking over and over and over again was which courses have they actually purchased. So if they're
Sure.
looking at the course page, which courses do they have access to? And then in line with that, are they subscribed? So can they just see all of the courses? So since that was something that my application needed to know over and over and over again, and it needed to know it at runtime because it needed to know it when the user was requesting that page. So it needed to say, this is the user, what should they actually be able to see? I wanted to minimize the times where those kinds of common requests that needed to happen at runtime needed to contact multiple services. And so in that case, it needed to talk to my database to find out who this user is and get their Stripe ID. And then it would need to go off to Stripe and find out whether they've subscribed and which courses they've purchased. And so in that case, that was where I decided that it was okay to duplicate some information to minimize those round trips. And so my Prisma database, I built a user in my Prisma database, which took the email that they had signed in to Auth0 with, and that became kind of the unique identifier for that user record. And then I would create a Stripe ID and store that alongside in my Prisma database. And then Prisma knew about which courses a particular user had purchased. So when they purchased a course, it would keep a record of that. And if they subscribed, then it would the Prisma database would keep up to date with that. And so rather than keeping all of this information about the subscription, the only question that my application was asking over and over again was like, is this person subscribed? So should they be able to see everything? So rather than keeping a big blob of information about the subscription, I just subscribed to new subscription webhooks and then just flipped a Boolean flag in the database to say, is subscribed is true or is subscribed is false. And that allowed my application to know everything that it needed to know just with one trip to Prisma. And then, any of those more complex anything where it actually needed to do anything more complex than that, it could go and talk to Stripe. But it kind of gave me that common use case that my application was requesting over and over and over again. I could kind of keep that localized to just within Prisma.
And I like that approach because often we'll over-optimize early on. And it sounds like what you did went the least optimized route, but just by storing everything where it could be. Although right at the beginning, you stored everything in Prisma, right? And then you decided to push it out to the edges again, and then just bring in what you needed when you realize there's a bottleneck, rather than trying to optimize for something that might never happen.
Yeah, that's right. And so, initially I was storing way too much data, thinking I might need this at some point, and so I should definitely have it in my Prisma database. I need to know everything. Everything needs to be in my system. But kind of realizing that it was okay to relinquish some of that control, and it was okay to let something else take on that responsibility. I think really simplified the logic in my application.
There's an interesting concept that I heard of, well, not heard of, but has been discussed. The difference between bringing everything into one place so that you can control it versus the extra expense of having it elsewhere. Because obviously with certain APIs, you're going to hit API limits. You might have to upgrade your account in order to be able to hit Stripe more often. I don't know whether they do that, but certain APIs will give you a certain number of connections per minute or month or whatever. So there can be costs involved in not optimizing, but often when you actually step back and you think about it from a commercial perspective, paying an extra $20, $50, $100 a month is probably cheaper than the amount of development time it would take, an extra maintenance overhead of managing this slightly more complicated code in reducing that traffic. So it's a fine balancing act. Yeah,
definitely. And it was when I realized that I was writing so much more additional logic to keep those things in sync. Like I needed to know so much more about what was going on and subscribe to so many more events. And then when I realized, I could just duplicate this one little part that my application constantly cares about, it just massively simplified things. There were just, more high level events that I could listen to and just, change that one value rather than,
I love that approach. It's really cool. So what's the name of this product, by the way? We keep talking about this project. What's it called?
It was just called
Does it have a logo? Courses. Okay. Does it have a logo?
Did it end up with a C? Surely it just has a lowercase c.
So no logo, just the word courses.
Yeah.
I noticed in the blog post as well, you didn't even bother with styling.
Yeah.
Which is fair.
Yeah, no,
That's not what we're trying to learn, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was very, very minimal on the styling. One thing that I also tried out with this was using Tailwind for the first time, and so
Okay.
Tailwind was used to style the app, but it wasn't sort of I didn't document that throughout the process. I kind of mentioned it at the start that I would use Tailwind, and then that I would talk about my what I thought of Tailwind, because prior to this project, I had a little bit of the attitude of like, what's the big deal with Tailwind? Why is everyone so excited about this? It's just inline
Yeah.
styles. But this application gave me the chance to actually play with it and see what the hype is all about.
I know James
so at the end,
has
I
been really keen on Tailwind recently as well, and I tried using it on a recent project, and I was of a similar mind that it's. See you, James.
Bye, James.
Have a great
Thanks
evening.
for stopping by.
It was a bit weird to think, well, all I'm doing is I'm just using the class name instead of inline styles. Like, what's the point? But it does make it so much easier to abstract. It's a very different way of thinking about styling. I still need to play with it more. I'm actually tempted to, because Tailwinds have a like a paid for product as well, where you can buy a whole load of pre-made components. I think it's a separate website, but it's by at least one of the founders or one of the creators of Tailwind. And I can see for rapid prototyping, I think it's like $250 US or something for the package, which is not nothing, but it's also like it could be a huge big time saving, especially from a corporate perspective for a sideline project. Absolutely. Which is why I haven't bought it yet. I'm not quite sure yet, but it does look like a really fun project to get into.
Yeah, I mean, it's that same idea that you mentioned before, where it's like, yeah, you could do all of this stuff yourself, but you could pay a little bit of money and just take away that whole concern. And so if they provide you all of the components that you'd need, or a big the majority of components that you need, could definitely be worth investing in. But yeah, I think
any developers out there listening, if you're thinking of buying it, check out to see whether it's tax deductible.
Good call. But yeah, I think
I'm not a tax advisor. This is not tax advice. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Yada yada yada.
But yeah, I think Tailwind was really good in the authoring experience. Firstly, the thing that I found really exciting about Tailwind was, I know this is like the silliest small aspect of it, but just like the reset was really nice. So resetting all CSS, it basically just takes away all styling. And so you might think that, oh, that means that I'm going to have to style absolutely everything. Like I'm going to have to style my H1s to be bigger, and it's going to add all this overhead to styling things that I wouldn't need to. But what it really does is it takes away all the overhead of unstyling all the things that you don't want to be styled that way. And so all of the unordered lists and all of the the styling around paragraphs and all of that stuff just disappears, which I know is a silly thing to say. This is why you should use Tailwind for the CSS
One of the biggest
reset.
peeves that I have with CSS is the margins around paragraphs and headers, and just if you, especially when you put containing visual boxes around them, and it can just push things out in the wrong way. So often it's just easier to do your own reset and set all headings and paragraphs to margin 0 and then go from there. So reset is definitely the way to go, I reckon.
Yeah, for sure. So I found that was really powerful. I also found it was really nice in like the authoring experience, like writing out, just being like, oh, I need an extra bit of padding above this or whatever. It's really easy to write that with Tailwind and not kind of switch context to outside of that. But I found coming back to the code when I had like really complex things, especially if I had like different styles for hover and different styles for those kinds of different situations. It was hard to read through the code and interpret everything that was going on really simply. I feel like having that more CSS layout with things in a list is a little bit more, I don't know, just from my very small experience, was a little bit more maintainable. But the authoring experience of being able to like quickly prototype something was awesome in Tailwind.
Brilliant. Love it. Jack's just mentioned in the comment as well, Tailwind UI is the name of the project I was thinking of. And he reckons it's 100% worth the dollars. He happily paid ages ago, and he keeps using it. Now, where is his kickback? Look, I've got nothing to do with the project, but Jack, next time I see you, I'll buy you a beer. which, I would have done anyway. that's fine. So what's next for the project? Do you have any more plans to expand on it, add more? Is there a part 7 coming?
I don't think for this one. Like, I think this was a very kind of specific project to learn these concepts and then create some materials to teach other people about this stuff.
Sure.
And so I don't think I'll be like actively working on this one. It was just basically an excuse to play with these tools and show off what I learned. My long-term plan is to potentially implement this same kind of system in my own personal sites and my own courses platform. At the moment, I only have a couple of just free courses, but it's nice to think that over time I would have enough time to build up some premium courses and have a big library there. But it would require me releasing a lot more courses and a lot more frequently to justify that kind of subscription model. Like, it just wouldn't make sense at this point. So, like, I would like to use it in the future when it makes sense to use it. But I guess the piece that I can really take away from it is just the knowledge of how to click all these little bits together and
Totally.
all the things that I learned along the way that I can take to other apps.
Definitely. That's something I found with a couple of side projects that I've done for much the same reason, as a learning process. Some of them I've streamed or videoed, and some of them have just been for my own personal learning process. But I always get to that point where I think I've learned so many great things, but I'm like 80% there. And I don't know that I've got the time or energy to do the last 20% to get it actually production ready. Like, I've got to put testing and all of these things into place. That obviously there's some testing done as part of the development process, but it's that next step of actually going live. That's the. I mean, that's potentially.
You don't write tests for a side project.
The money jump is. No.
Well,
unless there's a testing component to the video series or the blog post series that you're creating, then no, of course not. No testing. Oh dear. Yeah. So the project I was working on was a way to be able to get a whole lot of people to be able to pool funds to support projects that address climate change. And it came back from the days when we used to still fly. I used to calculate how much CO2 my flights generated, and my travel generated. And I found a whole lot of projects that I was really interested in supporting that could have offset that CO2 emission.
Wow.
And there was so much information out there. Like, when I was looking into it again at the end of 2019, there's a whole lot of information on how tree planting is not actually the best way of offsetting CO2 emissions. There are other ways that are much more effective and more sustainable in terms of a sustainable program. The reason a tree isn't great is because it gets to a certain mass and then its job is done. Whereas there are other ways that can actually keep going even after the tree is absorbed, like the majority of the CO2 it's ever going to take.
Right.
But of each of those programs, they would all have a minimum donation amount, and if I wanted to sponsor them all, then I was going to be paying way more than I needed to offset, which is not necessarily an issue. But I thought, what I'd like to do is create something where maybe I can get 20 people together to each put money into a pool, and then I can actually support them all with a minimum or not even minimum amounts. So I built this prototype called Hoist, and I used Auth0 and Stripe, but I basically stored the Stripe customer ID. So on first login, it would make an API call to generate a Stripe customer ID, and that would be stored in the app metadata in Auth0. So then the next time somebody logs in, the API could use the Auth0 management API to pull out their customer ID, and everything was stored in Stripe. Which then I face the same issues of, well, when you go to the account page and I want to see what subscription level I'm on, I've got to make a call to Stripe every single time. So I was looking into those caching kind of mechanisms as well. Interesting times.
Metadata in Auth0 was very helpful. That's how I solved one of the issues I had, where as I mentioned before, the first time a user signs in, it goes and creates a new user in my database and all of that stuff. And so I needed a way to know that was the first time that the user had signed in. Like, I didn't want that logic to run every single time a user logged in. And so the app metadata was perfect for that, because it didn't require me to go to Prisma and ask Prisma, does this user exist? And then if it doesn't, say, okay, Prisma, go and create it. It was being able to store it directly on that Auth0 record meant I knew straight away, like if that app metadata doesn't exist on this user, then I need to go and create a Prisma and a Stripe account. It's very cool.
Totally. So one other thing I always like to ask people, because I think that teaching is a great way of learning, and we often make mistakes while we're doing that. What are some of the big mistakes you made, or things that you found that you learned from while doing this project, you yourself?
Yeah, so one small mistake that I made was with the webhooks side of things. So I was using Auth0 to send one of my endpoints a message to say, hey, this is the first time this user has signed in, go and create all of these things for them. And so I had set up this endpoint and everything was working and it was all great. And then I realized, like way later than I should have, that this route was completely unsecured. And so I guess because, Auth0 had taken...
we've all been there. I laugh, but we've all been there.
Auth0 had made Auth so easy for me that I had forgotten that I also need to sometimes make sure that things are secured and do some of that work. And so, I mean, this wasn't a super crucial one where, the worst that could happen is someone could just hit that endpoint over and over and be creating unnecessary accounts in my Prisma database.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, it could have been something much, much worse. And so, making sure that I lock that down with like a signing secret or something, just to make sure this is definitely coming from Auth0. It's not just someone maliciously trying to hit this over and over and over again.
Very good.
I think another problem that I hit was like trying to, as this was kind of like a project primarily for teaching people how to do this stuff. I probably picked a problem that was a little bit too complex. I probably could have just focused on one part of the problem, like say just subscriptions. But wanting to build like a more realistic application, I had the free courses and premium courses, and then the idea of purchasing them individually or as subscriptions. That idea was pretty difficult to communicate once things got more and more complicated, especially in text form. Like I found that this could have potentially been maybe better as a video series where I could step through and give more like talk through visually what's going on. I found like writing there was a lot of blocks of code in the blog series that I wrote where it was there was a lot to explain for one block of code. So it would have been nice to just kind of simplify this down into less responsibilities. Trying to build, I'd say, like you mentioned before, with the preemptively optimizing things. I think in this application, I tried to kind of build everything to be super reusable. And so there was an example of this with the fetching logic for the courses. So because I'm using Next.js, I could build that page statically. And so I could go and fetch all the courses and then render them in the component and just make that a static HTML file. But because I thought, other areas of the application will probably need to know a list of courses. And so I should probably break this out into its own serverless function that can kind of handle that use case and then be able to use that over and over again, rather than kind of co-locating that logic of fetching the courses to just that one component.
Sure.
But yeah, I guess at the time that I was implementing it, that was completely unnecessary. It wasn't a part of what I was trying to solve. But I had big ideas that this app was going to be amazing, and it was going to, serve every.
Which of course it is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously. And so by building it into this serverless function, it seemed like a really good idea. It worked really well locally. But then when I went to deploy it, I realized I had created this race condition between these two things where to build my application, it was relying on a serverless function. But to deploy, as part of Vercel's process to deploy the application, it doesn't build the serverless functions and deploy those and then build your application and deploy that. It kind of deploys it all as one atomic collection or one version of your application. And so when it was trying to build that static page, it was making a request to that serverless function that didn't actually exist. And so, yeah, I guess the lesson was to not preemptively optimize. Like that's a pretty small case. I mean, it's not going too far out of my way, but just that idea of like, I need to solve this part, and so I'll build it in a reusable way that can be reused by everything. Kind of that, I guess, slowed me down a little bit in being able to deploy it. But also in doing that, well, it was frustrating and probably cost me a few hours or maybe multiple days. Let's be real. It took me a while to work out what was going on. While it was frustrating. Exactly. While it was frustrating at the time, it's like, I think I have a really good understanding of that now. And so I think it was a really good opportunity to dig really deeply into what's going on there. Because I feel like that's a problem that I've actually implemented multiple times where I've tried to make a request to a serverless function that doesn't exist. And I don't think I had that kind of existing mental model of how all of that stuff was happening. Yeah. So I feel like I have a much better understanding.
On a tangent at the moment, and I'm trying to work out whether you could get a double build process where it builds the first time, so the serverless function exists, but the generation part of it fails.
Yeah.
So it does it again, but only a half step recompilation, because now the serverless function does exist.
Yeah, but that would potentially work. I wonder if there's also there's probably a way to like I think there are environment variables that give you the current preview deployment URL of what you're building, and so that might also address this issue. And it would only be an issue realistically the first time that you tried to build your application, because the next time it would make a request to the last deployment, and so it would be live. But yeah, this or I guess that's what I was about to say. Yeah, as long as you never touch it again, never do anything.
That's right.
It would be.
You have to version your APIs just so that your build process works.
That's right. Exactly.
Crazy. Oh, sounds fascinating. Sounds like you learned so much doing that. It's amazing.
Yeah. It was a very.
I realize we're coming up to kind of the 1 hour mark, and I know we don't really have a time cap on this, but if anybody in the comments does have any questions, stick them in there, and we're happy to take questions at any time, really, from the viewers. So you've hinted at the idea that maybe it'll become something that could possibly go live. Right at the beginning, when I asked you, is this something you want to put into production and actually make money from, I noticed you skirted that question completely. And I guess it comes down to what you were saying before about the fact that you don't really know whether you've got enough material to put in so that it's actually worthwhile having an online course mechanism. What about taking on some of the big competitors that may or may not have been mentioned in this stream already, and providing a mechanism for anybody to upload their own content? Is that something you've considered? Is that maybe a future part of the series too? Multi-user?
It could potentially be. I'd say that definitely played into the building of this application. I think like the idea of building a simple way for someone to create an online store, or create a way to sell their stuff online. Yeah. I think part of the motivation of learning more about Stripe and going down that path was looking at how badly affected everyone has been by the current situation of the world, and how many businesses have been affected by not being able to have a physical store. And so creating a way that people could easily and quickly put their things up to be able to sell them online was definitely part of the motivation. And then kind of creating this series, this blog series, and now I'll be working on an Egghead course that's coming out later this year on a similar stack. I guess part of the motivation behind that is kind of teaching people how to do that for themselves. And so I guess the audience isn't just developers who are able to piece these things together, but maybe people who don't have as much experience with software development having like an easy pathway to click all these bits together. It might be slightly ambitious for them to be able to build their own version of this. But yeah, that was definitely part of the motivation was looking at a more simple way to get more people with online stores and ways to sell their things. But I guess part of the like building a white label like version of this application, so something that someone could just use for their own business and put their own branding on and all of that. I started thinking down that path and then just realized like, this is what Shopify is. Like Shopify solves this problem very well. And like, I guess like part of the motivation was like wrapping Stripe in something that's more simple than that or something that you can kind of do that you could deploy your own version of with very little code experience. But yeah, I think Shopify solves that exact problem. If there was like a differentiator in what I was trying to build, if there was a problem that I saw that existed with something like a new problem that this could solve, then it would definitely be a cool project to work on. But yeah, I think I realized that the competitors in the space were doing too many cool things. And so I guess my competitive advantage was being able to explain it to other people and being able to teach them what I had learned along the way.
Fair enough. I like that twist. It's a reframing. Developer Steve,
right.
Hey, how are you doing? He's just asked, any plans to also have integrations into pay terminals for in real life payments via the online store?
No plans at this point. I think, if I was going to look at integrating with any kind of hardware, I'd probably look at, again, there are other people doing this kind of awesome stuff. So Square, I don't know how, like, I know Cash App and Square are big companies worldwide. I don't know how much they have captured the market in terms of integrating hardware and card payments and things as much as they have here in Australia. But in Australia, I think like almost every restaurant and cafe and everything has a Square terminal to handle their all of their payments and their kind of point of sale system. So again, there's already someone doing a really, really good job addressing that that thing that was difficult in the past.
Fair enough. So I'm going to paste up the link here to the blog post that you wrote, just in case anybody wants to go and find out more. If anybody did want to, I mean, obviously there's the blog post that I've just posted, but if anybody wants to do something similar, where's the starting points? Other than perhaps this is going to go up onto YouTube later, so maybe watching the video again and getting an idea of where you started from. But do you have any like top tips for where to get started if you want to start your own software as a service platform to address whatever kind of itch it is that they're trying to scratch?
Yeah, I think just playing with Stripe as much as possible would be a really good starting point. Like I said, their docs are amazing. The resources that people have created around integrating Stripe with different languages or different frameworks are awesome. That would probably be a good starting point. Like you mentioned, I think part of what I wanted to teach in this course was about webhooks and also about migrations in databases and things like that. I had probably bitten off a little bit too much to explain in this one course, and so I may have kind of overcomplicated some of the architecture by wanting there to be a database in the middle. But as you mentioned, there are ways that you can use the app metadata and use what Stripe is already storing on your behalf and potentially completely eliminate a database. And so, yeah, I think playing with Stripe, playing with things that already exist like Auth0 that solve parts of those problems, just so you can try and get a store online and start selling things.
Very cool. Well, in anticipation of this being on YouTube, if you do follow any of these guides and you create your own software as a service platform, hit us up in the comments. Let us know what you're creating and what you're working on. It would be fun to find out what other people are trying to create, and whether you're creating it for fun, like Jon did, and for learning, or whether you're creating it for an actual business purpose and you're hoping to make money out of it. I'd love to find out more. Thanks, Jon, so much for your time. It's been really awesome chatting with you. We'll definitely have to do this again sometime. And also, maybe I'll catch up with you separately sometime, and we'll have to talk about actions, which is kind of the most recent replacement from Auth0 for rules and hooks, which I think you might enjoy. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
yeah, thanks for taking the time. This has been really good.
Awesome. Thank you so much.